A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hello, everybody. We're here with Kate Gray. Kate Gray is a games writer and journalist with a special interest in portrayals of sex, sexuality, and relationships in video games. She's currently working on writing for several games, including one that's all about dating. No sex, implied sex. In her spare time, she enjoys cooking, whittling, and pottery like a character out of Wind of the Willows. Kate, welcome to the show. Yay!
Thank you. Hello.
We're recording on the day before Valentine's Day. Not that the Valentine's Day necessarily the day for kinks or anything, but I thought I'd throw that in. Let's just start with, what are kinks?
Okay. So kinks are a pretty broad umbrella that encompass sexual preferences or turn-ons that are considered not vanilla. Kinks are when somebody finds something sexually attractive or sexually arousing that is not considered basic. So this can include anything. It can include BDSM. That's probably the most well-known kink, which stands for
bondage, domination, and submission.
It can stand for a lot of different things. That's the issue.
Okay.
So bondage is normally the B.
Right.
But D can be dominance, and then S can be submission. But then S can also be sadism, and M can be masochism. So there's a lot of different things that encompasses. But normally, when you think of BDSM, you think of someone in a very tight black latex suit and a whip. And that's sort of what we're going with here. It can also include, other common kinks are things like leather play, role play, pretty much, anything not considered vanilla. It is in contrast to fetishes. Fetishes are considered sexual requirements. You cannot get off without them. So that is different, but you will hear the terms used sort of pretty interchangeably because not everybody subscribes to like hard definitions like that.
So can a kink be a fetish if that's the case? So that
good question.
Where you need you need that particular thing. Can we then go and say essentially that a fetish is whatever we're going to say is not basic? So we're kind of contrasting whatever is not vanilla, we're going to call a kink?
I mean, I think so. I'm worried about getting into the weeds with it and saying something that is technically not true. But you can think of kinks as, something that somebody likes to introduce in a usually sexual scenario that gets them off, turns them on. It doesn't have to be included for that person to enjoy sex. It doesn't have to be a sexual thing either. It can be very much like they are getting sexual pleasure from it, but it is not sexual itself. There are a lot of kinks that are not sexual in a lot of contexts. And we can talk about those more later if you like.
Yeah, sure. Food, ice, different kinds of clothings, that might not necessarily be, role play itself, right?
And there are some kinks that are physically impossible for various reasons. So inflation kink, for example, where a person finds it erotic to imagine being inflated, which obviously is too dangerous to do in real life. There are ways of simulating it, but
I'm so glad you told me that, because I was really worried you were talking about like the rise of the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, that might come under financial domination, which is also like a subset of domination. Findom is quite a big kink. It in a lot of ways it manifests as people just sending money to dominatrixes, and they don't even necessarily have to do anything sexual, because part of the kink of financial domination is that maybe you're sort of being humiliated in a way. That's not always the case, but that can be a part of it. So if you're sending money to a woman, for example, and she's like, and you're not going to get anything for it, that could be part of the sexual thrill. So, yeah.
A large
trying
range.
Very hard not to be in any way judgmental.
Yeah, and that's part of reason why we have this episode.
That's right.
On the one hand, there are situations where many of us want to say, well, whatever floats your boat, right? Everybody gets turned on, but whatever they turned on. And then there's people that think that there's something wrong sometimes with a kink in itself, and that there's also a question about how they're represented. So let's turn this to games and talk about where we actually encounter them. Though, honestly, I mean, Kate, I could hear you go on and on and on about the different kinds of kinks, because that's really fun to hear. But to stay at least on topic, where and how can kinks or reference to kinks be found in video games?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of creators out there who are making explicitly kinky games, explicitly in the sense that they are, going out there and saying we're kinky, and explicit in the sense that there's nudity and actual sex in the games. So to name check some of those, Christine Love is one that comes up quite frequently, who, as part of Love Conquers All Games, which is Christine Love's studio, made Lady Killer in a Bind, which is probably one of the most well-known and maybe best-selling kink games. Like, it's quite mainstream in terms of like the kink game genre, if you will. Lady Killer in a Bind specifically deals with a lot of broader kinks, but a lot of more specific kinks. So the main one it deals with is BDSM, but also sapphic sex in particular. But it can also, like, some of the scenes will deal with more specific kinks. So it'll deal with shibari, which is being tied up in a very specific way, or with a sort of non-consensual sex kind of scenario. There is also, in terms of other creators, there is Ghost Hug Games, who made Hard Coded, which is a quite beautiful sort of transhumanist tale of sex in a future where, like, trans identities and cyborg identities. I think it's cyborg. I get mixed up with cyborg and android. But android, I think, is fully...
Android is fully tech and looks like a person. Cyborg is a mix. Wow, the idea of a trans and cyborg makes so much sense.
Yeah, like, exactly. It's a really interesting way of dealing with, like, trans identities.
Yeah.
And a sort of cyberpunk in the most actual way. Like, a lot of times people deal with cyberpunk as an aesthetic, but cyberpunk itself is not an aesthetic. And I think Hard Coded does a really good job of that. It also has tentacle sex in it and, like, a bunch of other stuff. So, it's not just dealing with one thing. That's sort of a common thread with a lot of these games, is they're not just dealing with one fetish, or kink, I should say. They're dealing with a lot of different things, and also dealing with sexuality and identity at the same time. I discovered one while I was researching called DID games, which stands for damsel in distress. So there's another kink, is this sort of like, there's a helpless person and sex is involved in some way. Anna Valens, who has done games like Blood Pact, which also deal with like a succubus type character, and a sort of domination kind of thing. And there's Robert Yang, who primarily makes stories dealing with gay men in various situations. They tend to be sexual, but not always. But sometimes he does also make games with kinks in them.
That's interesting. So you've got the damsel in distress trope. In this case, are you the damsel in distress, or are you the person that would be, or are you playing the fantasy of ravishing the damsel in distress? Or both?
I actually hadn't heard of the damsel in distress games before, so I actually don't know.
Right.
I think I can imagine they do it both ways.
All right.
Because if there is a kink out there called damsel in distress, you can imagine that there are people who enjoy being the damsel in distress, and people who like being the knight in shining armor. A lot of kinks work that way, where there's sort of like two different roles. Like BDSM, there's like a dom and a sub, there's a sadism and a masochism. You kind of have to have a really good symbiotic pairing for a lot of kinks to work. So yeah, I can imagine it going both ways.
Yeah. It's really interesting how in real life you really need the pairing to work. Mm-hmm. In a video game you can simulate it, or potentially I guess you can match. Do you know of any games that actually and Andy, I guess this would go to you. Like, do you if either one of you guys know any games that would actually put a context in the context of a game, someone that, let's say, does get to play someone who's dominant and someone who's submissive, they get to play someone submissive and they get to do it together?
I can't think of any offhand, but it seems like the value of the computer game would be that it seems like finding somebody to be the to have that opposite pair might be difficult to do. And so the computer would be the AI version of your partner, I would guess.
I mean, that's what I was going to say as well. It's difficult, I can imagine, to find a dominatrix in a lot of places. It's difficult to find. A lot of kinks involve equipment that can be quite pricey. So it is sometimes difficult to find the pairing that involves like either finding somebody who is very into that. Like some kinks are lifestyle choices, and it can be difficult to find somebody who is living that lifestyle or who has that equipment. And so I can imagine that video games are much easier to turn to if you're looking for something that is either highly specific, hard to find, or expensive.
Right. In fact, I would think that this is where, my wife told me about a woman she knows who is a professional submissive. So not a professional dominatrix, because that seems kind of easy, right? So people come to you, and you dominate them, but it seems really dangerous to be a professional submissive, right? And she says there's a lot of vetting going on as far as that goes. But a video game can be essentially you log in, and here's the fantasy I want to play. I can be this, I can be that, and it could be an amazing place in that sense for people to enact their fantasies. Though I could see how it might be a challenge to program. I was curious, and if anybody's listening and are thinking of making that game and want to let us know, please let us know. So, who's making kinky games or games with kinks, and why? Is there a good diversity as far as kink games?
I think what I've found over the years is that the people making kink games are the people with those kinks, which makes sense. It could be even part of that kink to make a game about it and to explore it through a game and by having other people play it. So I find that a lot of smaller games that are made by very small studios on very small budgets tend to be the more specific kinks because they are made by people with those kinks. Even so,
I think you'd certainly want to know if this wasn't your kink and you were making a game about this. Like, I would want to know a lot more about it than what I do now, of course. But so it makes sense that the people that would know the most about it are all the people making the games.
Yeah, I mean, most kinky games tend to be BDSM or tentacles, and it doesn't really tend to go more granular than that in terms of kinks. As I've mentioned, I think there are a lot of kinks out there. There are things that you would not think were sexy at all will be sexy to someone else. Like a foot fetish is quite a common one to be like, either like you could be repulsed by feet, you can be unbothered by feet, you can be turned on by feet. And I think it's quite hard to sort of cross the lines for a foot fetish into understanding how people feel about them.
Right.
So there are a lot of kinks like that are turn-ons for some people and turn-offs for others, rather than just being kind of in between for everybody. Yeah. So BDSM is a very popular one in games for obvious reasons. It is by far the most popular kink. Almost like coming full circle and being vanilla in itself because it's so popular. And I think that a lot of that is that video games, because they are a commercial project, even when they are art, made for the sake of being art, not necessarily to make money, you do tend to suffer from wanting to appeal to a majority. And we see that all over the place, especially in AAA games, with character creators in particular are made to appeal to a majority. You can edit your eyes and your nose, and you can give yourself scars, and sometimes you can give yourself skin conditions, but generally you cannot have a character with a limb difference or with a disability, because I guess because there are just so many different variants, it becomes very hard to actually represent it in any meaningful way. And in the same way, I think there isn't a lot of diversity in kinks because generally games tend to be about like 1 to 5 kinks max. And the more sort of granular you get with the kinks, the more it's going to be a turnoff to someone else. I think anyway.
Right. No, I mean that which would make sense. I mean, and BDSM are probably the most common. It's interesting you say if you're in a kink community, then vanilla versions of BDSM could seem very, very tame. But for most people, right, you start getting too radical on on your kink, and they're gonna pull away, and it's not gonna work, and you're still making a game you want people to play.
Yeah, I mean, kinks in AAA games are, as far as I can think of, pretty much entirely BDSM and maybe leather at the most.
So I can imagine where a game can allow you also to go more extreme with your kink than you could possibly go.
Oh yeah,
in
absolutely.
real life too.
Yeah, especially in the VR space. There's a lot of interesting kink stuff there. I don't have a VR headset, so I haven't really played a lot of them. But it's an interesting space for kink games because of like the perspective that you get with VR.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah. It's interesting. The first thing that popped into my mind was asphyxiation. And as something that someone might do in VR that they're too scared to do in real life. But of course, in VR, you can't. The whole point is that you're feeling yourself being asphyxiated. And I realized, wait, that's probably not a very good one to put into a VR game.
Yeah, I'm not even sure how you would.
Right. You need a haptic suit, I guess, that makes.
I think it would be possible. Like VR pretty much solely deals with visuals. But that can still be quite affecting. There have been people who have played VR Skyrim, and they will go into like a pub or a tavern or whatever it's called in Skyrim and eat a bunch of food, and it will not feel like they're eating because they literally, like, in terms of senses, they are not getting that input. But because their visuals and the sound and everything are affirming that they are eating, it still does affect them in some way. And I think that could be portrayed very well with something like asphyxiation. You could have the screen sort of going black, and maybe you're not getting like the sense of being choked. But I think it would be more dangerous to make a haptic suit that can choke you, because it wouldn't have the control of a human being. But we haven't really touched on it, but there are a lot of sort of dangerous kinks, obviously asphyxiation being one of them. And there are a lot of rules and I don't even know methods, I think, that have been introduced in certain kinks to make them more safe. And asphyxiation is one of them, in which the general consensus is to choke either side of the neck. That's where the arteries, veins, blood is, but not to compress the windpipe, because that is the dangerous part.
Wow. Okay.
And so, if you had a haptic suit that was trying to simulate being choked, it wouldn't have that control. It wouldn't know what to do, and it could get very dangerous very quickly.
Right.
I'm interested in it. It's interesting. I didn't think we'd be talking about VR at all, but now you got me interested in VR. It's interesting with some of the, when I think about games that do involve, let's say sexualized violence, right? Right. The idea is the more realistic they get, the more they're supposed to have an impact on the player. And here I'm talking about impact that some researchers talk about in terms of creating essentially sexist attitudes, right? Objectification, rape myth acceptance, potentially leading to sexual harassment and possibly rape. It's really interesting to hear that VR might be, this place where at the same time you get, you're playing fantasies. It's almost a test case of what these research in this area, I think, is imperfect. And we had Rachel Cohen here a while ago, who talked about the state of research and what the research really says, for example, on how games affect sexism. And she was somewhat skeptical about this, but to a degree. And I guess this is not a question, but it's a concern. Part of me does worry about where that can go. And the minute you get into the virtual reality world, to me, it becomes an almost different kind of thing.
Like, is the concern that we will get used to the way an AI, like, let's say I'm in a BDSM game and I'm the dominant one, and the computer is portraying a submissive character, but they're portraying it in a very specific way. And then if I try this in real life with somebody and they don't respond the same way that I am used to, then it could get dangerous.
Sure. I mean, this is in some sense in line with just the idea of, pornography itself representing a fantasy, right?
Right.
And the question of whether the fantasy it represents essentially makes it so that the people engaged in that fantasy will tend to confuse the fantasy with real life in some way, or that it would normalize behavior that then they would, use in their everyday life on, partners that they think they would imagine would want something to happen when really they don't.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I would say that it's a legitimate concern, and I think it is one that comes into most people's minds immediately when you think about VR, sex games, kink, especially the kind of kinks that we can sort of sort kinks into three vague categories. One is having stuff done to you. One is looking at somebody in a specific outfit or in a specific way, but maybe not actually interacting with them. And then one is doing something to another person. And that last one is where it really starts to matter about, what attitudes is this game going to be teaching you? I think that having an attitude towards women, towards sex, towards anything like that, tends to be part of a media diet. I think people tend to blame games as being sources of violent behavior, sexist behavior. And that's absolutely one of the main ways that you can see that, because it is so much more interactive. But it's part of a media diet. It's part of, you're watching things like, The Last of Us on TV, which is also going to have a lot of violence in it. You're watching TV shows that are from an older era that have sexism in them. You're going to the playground or to school or to class or to work and hanging out with other people who also have those ideas, outdated ideas about women or ideas about violence and things like that. And it just keeps reaffirming that same stance that you already have. I don't think that anybody goes to a game, sees something and immediately goes, yeah, I'm making that part of my personality now. I don't think anyone does that with anything. But it gets leveled at games so often because I think of its interactivity and also its form. It's like a new medium. It's, movies have been around long enough that we're like, oh, movies, they're fine.
Right.
Books have been around longer. So, books, they've never hurt anyone. Video games are still relatively new on the scene, are not particularly well moderated in some circles, especially online games, VR games, or that kind of thing. Are particularly good at giving dopamine to people, especially effective on younger people. And so they can be harmful in a different way to the rest of someone's media diet. But that doesn't mean that they alone are harmful.
I think it's important to say, as you did at the beginning, that part of it is also, the attitude that's being conveyed. The not just what is being shown, but what is the values that are being transmitted here. Let's switch to the positive part, because I thought that we've already talked about one possibility that video games can do in terms of kinks that is hard to do in real life, which is just matching people. Not that we know that this is done, but and matching people in a safe environment, right? Because it's a virtual environment. So, I mean, it seems to me, many people might be curious about a kink, but they're not sure how to bring it up with a partner, or maybe they don't have a partner to try it out with. Can adult games be a safe space for kink exploration?
Absolutely. I would argue that they're maybe the best space for it. As we've already mentioned, like a lot of kinks involve some kind of investment, time, money, finding the right person. A lot of the good safe spaces for kink exploration are places like sex clubs. but those come with their own risks. Like you wouldn't want to go to one and find out that everybody was like 40 years older than you and feel really weird about that, and kind of left out. And then that's an extra factor on top of the fact that you've been brave enough to go out to a sex club in the first place.
Oh, that's so intimidating.
Yeah, or
most
maybe
people, yeah.
you have to drive, and like I currently don't drive. I couldn't get to a sex club unless it was within walking distance, Maybe you live in a smaller town, maybe you have a religious family, you wouldn't want them to find out about it. So, there are a lot of restrictions on safe spaces in the real world. But
Right.
if we go to video games, the barrier to access is relatively low. When we talk sex games, primarily, like almost predominantly, they are all on PC. So there are some like sexy games on console, but generally the sort of games I've been talking about will be on PC.
That's because the consoles control to some extent what goes on them.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. It is a little difficult to find games.
Nintendo, for example, does not
Mhm.
want adult content on its games. It doesn't want to become associated with adult content.
They've been
at
a
all.
little more lax in the Switch era, but
Mhm.
still there are some like I don't know what the back end rules are for the Switch eShop, but I'd imagine they're pretty draconian. Steam as well is pretty limiting, but you can find more stuff on there. But if you go to a space like itch.io or like a specific dedicated sex game website, like Nutaku, I think is one of the bigger ones, there's often no barrier to entry except sometimes the cost of the game and sometimes having to like have a PC that can run it. But we're not talking like the Witcher 3 level graphics here usually, so it's not too bad.
The biggest barrier for entry for me, because I went to do a little bit of research before this, is I don't know. I mean, here's these weird websites that are asking me to download software. And we all know that that's a bad idea, right?
Yeah. I think that maps sort of onto like real life kink and sex spaces, is that if you find a place that has a code of conduct and emphasizes consent, that is going to be very different than a sort of seedier place that perhaps doesn't care about how its patrons behave. And I think that sort of maps onto storefronts, maybe not that well, but if you go to a storefront and it doesn't feel like it's trying to infect your computer, I've generally found that those are going to be the more respectful games that care about its players' well-being and aren't just there to sort of sexualize a community of people.
So that's interesting. So there is some sort of like scale of seediness,
I think
even
it's
within the
sort
kink
of,
community.
I don't want to moralize too much because it is absolutely okay to sort of fetishize like most sex games that you see out there are a very particular type of sex game. They're usually aimed at like a straight male player, and they are usually very like all the characters have quite large boobs, and that is fine. That is a kink. It's a fairly vanilla kink, I'd imagine, but it is still one, and I don't want to necessarily shame people for being attracted to that. But I do find that the games I have played on itch.io tend to be more sort of ethically made, which is not to say that those other games are like made in a sweatshop or are unethical, but they are more likely to treat their non-playable characters as humans, or sometimes they're not human, so maybe that doesn't always track. Sometimes they're a tentacle monster that lives in the sewers, but
humanely, maybe.
Humanely, yes, that's a good way of putting it. The waters get very muddy there because there are a lot of kinks that involve not wanting to be treated humanely. So I don't want to come down as black or white on this issue. I think that yes, it is a good place for kink exploration, but I think that a lot of sex games are not really made with treating, in particular, women particularly humanely. And I think that is a concern that I have, and probably a lot of other women have. And there are a lot of more unsavory tropes in those kind of games.
So let's talk about some of those. I mean, but let's try to keep it in the context of kink. I mean, there's two things here, as there's the representation itself of bodies or of attitudes, and then there's the issue of consent and dealing with those consent. Which one do you want to go first? Should we do? Let's do, I guess, I don't know, representation first.
I definitely don't want to go out there and say that if you are wanting to play kinky games, then you have to play a kinky game that is concerned with diversity, representation. I think that is maybe moralizing too much. But I think at the same time, you have to understand that the porn industry is not a very diverse place. And that is a systemic issue. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this, to be honest. But
well, we haven't really talked about, I mean, we sort of circled around this, but we're talking about kinky games, but are they pornography? And you mentioned them as being art a little while ago. Is it art? Is it pornography? Can it be both?
I think it can be both. Absolutely. Yes. I think in general, the pornography space has a lot of issues right now and always has. And those happen in games too.
Do kink games fall within the broader category of pornography, or
I think so. Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of kinky games out there that are not in themselves pornography. For example, Bayonetta is a very kinky game. Like the main character she is like a dom. She has a sort of bondage thing going on. She has a whip. Her outfit is made of her own hair. Right. That feels like a kink, right? And it is not a kinky game. It is not an adult game. Well, I think it's adult in the sense that it has violence, but it is not a sexy adult game.
Right.
It's extremely violent.
It doesn't. I haven't played it much, but I don't think it has any like gratuitous nudity or like sex scenes or anything like that.
I don't think so.
It has a lot of butts in it, I think. But it's not a sex game, and it's not pornography. So the lines are blurry between, like, not all kink games are pornography, not all pornography is kinky.
Right. So we're talking about things that turn people on, right? And things that turn people on can be, pornography might be one end of that.
Yeah.
And
we're
spectrum.
Specifically talking about turning people on sexually, right? Because I can be turned on in lots of different ways. You were talking about feet fetish earlier, and
that is a sexual fetish.
It can be, but I actually like them aesthetically.
All right.
And you can also play Bayonetta and enjoy the aesthetics of it, but not find it sexually arousing. You can just be like, wow, she's got really nice legs. She does, but they're very long.
Right. and you might cosplay as her because you enjoy the aesthetic of the costume and not be at all interested in sex play in the costume, right?
Yeah. And likewise, there are games out there that are not intended to be kinky, but will be someone's kink.
Right.
Yeah,
I can't think of any examples, but there will be.
I was about that's what I was about to ask you, because it sounds like
Animal Crossing.
Sure.
I don't know.
that would be a weird one, but sure. I mean, I'm assuming there's got to be some. I want to now kind of go to the other one, which was consent, right? Consent specifically with kinks, right? When you're talking about, let's say, the BDSM community, there's kind of well-developed patterns for safety and acknowledging consent, right? But what do you do when you're putting that into a video game? What sort of issues might come up with consent when you're putting kinks into a video game?
Consent is one of my favorite topics. Be prepared for me to have a lot of things to say.
Let's do it. Sure.
So consent in general, in sex, but in general, is still quite a new concept to a lot of the world. In kink communities and in queer communities, it has been a thing for a long time, but it's only really started to make it into the mainstream as a concept. And it is very much a nascent topic still. A lot of people don't quite get it. A lot of people do get it, but there's a lot of situations where it's not clear. And obviously all of that maps onto games as well.
I would think especially because when you're coming to some power play situations, the blurring of consent itself can be part of the excitement.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That makes it even harder to do.
And consent can be withdrawn at any point. So in the middle of something, and that is very difficult. Like psychologically, that is a difficult thing to go through because you are in the middle of a very vulnerable, intimate moment, and somebody very suddenly has backed out of it. And to respect consent in that situation, you can respect it immediately, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't leave you with some kind of feeling that you then have to tackle on your own. But I think consent also in games, we've only just begun to see what it could possibly mean and how it can be modeled. Systems for content warnings and opting out in particular are so new that I don't really know if they've been done well yet. I don't want to say that like no one's ever done them well, because I haven't played I haven't played a lot of games. And usually when I play games, I'm reviewing them. So I don't opt out because I'm reviewing it. I have to see everything. So for example, there's a game, I forget what it's called, but it's about spiders. And you can turn off the spider content from the very beginning. You can go into the settings, turn off spider content. But is that enough? Is it enough to have a setting? Because, players might not know that it's there, even though it's a spider game. So maybe.
So, by the way, we're not talking about a sex game with spiders, right?
No, although I'm sure spiders are also a kink. But no, this is just an example of a content warning or an opt-out option.
Right.
And so
in this specific case, it's a game about spiders. Yeah. It's probably got spiders all over the box or all over the
well, no more boxes, but yeah.
Right, no more boxes, but all over the load screen or whatever. So at some point, the consent is implied that if you're playing this game, you're okay with spiders, but yet they still have an option to get rid of the spiders.
Can I break this down a little bit more? So we're talking here about the consent of, first of all, the consent of the player in terms of content warnings, right? So that's kind of the first place you're going with this. Yeah. Then there's the possibility of the player playing a role in a kink situation relating to the NPC in terms of, again, it sounds weird, right? Giving the NPC the opportunity to consent, showing the NPC has the opportunity to consent, withdrawing consent as the NPC, which does sound like it could leave you in a really vulnerable position, but is also the way the world really works. And then you've got the possibility of consent in multiplayer games that are exploring kinks together. Yeah, that's a lot.
It is a lot. Yeah, this is why consent is so fascinating to talk about, because it is a problem that we have as a society that shows that we care so much about ourselves, our own well-being, and about the well-being of others. But no one really knows how to tackle it in every situation. It's very much a case-by-case basis sort of thing. And NPC consent is one of my sort of pet topics that I like talking about, largely as a sort of philosophical exercise. Because if you say to people like, should NPCs be able to be consenting to activities, then a lot of people will very quickly say, no, they're not real. And that is true. And I don't want people to listen to me saying, hey, should NPCs be able to consent, and think, oh, this person just wants to make everything hard. This person Like, I think that is the gut reaction, and I understand that people are thinking, well, oh, even fake video game characters have to consent now.
But you know what? No, I will take a stronger stance than you on that. Then I can say that a character as written is, you build a character, you build a something that's happening in somebody's mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're building this little model of a person when you create a character in any sort of fictional work, whether it's a game or a movie or a book or whatever. And these characters are real in their minds, and therefore they should be able to. They have things that they like and things that they dislike and things that they will do and things that they won't do and things that are in character for them, things that are out of character for them. So yes, I think that fictional characters should be able to withdraw consent.
Okay, I'll give you a really interesting example of how I think this has been done well, which is in Dragon Age Inquisition, which is a game that will come up a lot when you're talking about sex, kinks, relationships, and consent in games. Dragon Age Inquisition has a ton of dateable characters, like any BioWare game has. One of them is a sort of dominating kind of guy. He's extremely wide, broad, muscly, and it turns out very kinky. First time I'd ever seen kinks in games was in Dragon Age Inquisition, which wasn't even that long ago. And it's more on the vanilla side of kink in that it is BDSM and really only just the D. But it deals with consent. He continually asks you if you're okay to carry on. And at one point, your character's sort of like, I don't think you're going hard enough. And he's like, I don't think, because he's a different race. He's a Kunari. He's huge. I was playing a dwarf character, so he was maybe 4 times my size. And he was saying, I don't think you can handle if I go hard. And your character can be like, yeah, no, you're right. You would kill me. Not literally.
So are these options for the player to choose for right? Okay,
it is
so
during a non-explicit but still pretty raunchy sex scene.
Right.
And he sort of says like, do you want me to do that? And you can be like, yeah, do it. Right. And then later, you sort of cut to them on the bed and you're like, oh my God. There is another character in the same game in Dragon Age Inquisition called Dorian. And this was another example of the first time I had ever seen this modeled in a game. Dorian says no to you. Specifically, he says no to you if you are playing as a female character and you like him. You want to take your relationship to the next level. And you've been flirting this whole time. If you engage in romantic options with Dorian, he reciprocates. He's flirty, you're flirty. It's a great time. But then when you're like, oh, I've played video games before. I know how this goes. We're going to have a scene now where we hook up. You go into that scene expecting to hook up. And he goes, oh, I think you've misunderstood the signals here. I'm not into women. I'm really sorry. And, as a player, that can feel pretty devastating. It can feel, it feels exactly like it's supposed to feel. Like a guy that you had feelings for is like, I'm gay. Did you not know? And you're like, no, I didn't know. I think the initial reaction is embarrassment. If someone says no to something in a game, especially when it comes to that vulnerable, intimate relationship, sex kind of thing, you feel embarrassed, you feel hurt, you feel angry even. But that is how you would feel in real life if somebody withdrew consent. That's why I say it's a very messy thing to have somebody withdraw consent in the middle of something, and you have to be strong enough to accept it because it leaves you with so many feelings. But it worked really well in the game because what happens with Dorian is after he sort of gently lets you down, you get another scene with him where he says, listen, I really liked flirting with you. I'm sorry that it's not going to go anywhere, and I'm sorry if I led you on, but if you want to keep flirting, I'd be down. Just like harmless flirting. Right. And you can say, you can be like, no, that's a bit too much for me. Or you can be like, yeah, all right. And
that's cool.
It's a wonderful modeling of a very human relationship, except I don't think there's not that many humans in the game. I don't remember if he's human. I think he's
Sorry.
again
Right.
human in the sense of like
Right.
humane. And I think that is possible in games, and modeling that kind of consent in games. It's not the job of a game developer to be a teaching tool, but it's also useful to show these kind of very mature situations in games and have players like me go into them, experience them, and then know how they would react. I think that's really beautiful. And I think that would be really nice to see with kinks as well. So that's why I think NPCs should be able to consent, because you get moments like that.
I think those were really great examples. Though I was thinking about, because we started playing about kinks that are in sex games, and it's interesting, like what happens when you're like, if that happened in a sex game, that would be weird, unless the point is to tease you, because the fantasy is the whole point.
Yeah,
And
I don't think anybody. I think this is why a lot of sexy and kinky games put you in the submissive role, is because a dominatrix is always consenting, because that's
Right.
I shouldn't say always consenting. You can absolutely withdraw consent as a dominatrix, but as
Right.
long as you're doing dominatrixy things, you are consenting to it, I think. Anyway, I'm worried that there's edge cases for everything, and that I'm just
There
Right.
yeah.
but
Hey,
yeah.
hey, Kate, just to be clear, and maybe to our listeners, just to be clear, we're exploring the topic. This is nobody's final opinion on anything.
Right.
You know, I mean,
I was gonna say, like, you have to come to discussions like this in good faith,
yeah,
because there are absolutely edge cases for most sexual things where there could be, like, in quotes, problematic kinks that you're forgetting about or that you don't know exist. And if you're saying, kinks are this, kinks are that, then you could reasonably be like, well, actually, but that is not coming to the discussion in good faith. Sex positivity is important. And trying to catch people out is not a useful way of coming to discussions.
Right.
Yeah.
right.
It's really difficult to talk about sex in games.
It is, and I mean, look, I think it's really difficult to talk about sex in general, because sex is just so varied and so personal, and touches people in so many different ways. And when you're talking about in the context of games, you're talking about it in the context of both fun, like in Dragon Age, which I regret not finishing now, because I apparently missed out on all this and Inquisition. But you've got the fun part, but then you got also what can be a serious exploration of your own kinks, in a game format, right? I mean, it can go from a place where you're just, it's a AAA game that's fun for everybody, or it's a very special personal situation that is maybe even very fulfilling for you, or and very meaningful for you. Or it could be the sort of thing that you might have very mixed feelings about. Yeah. And this, and the very mixed feelings about is a really interesting one, where we're talking about kinks that you might not feel comfortable that you have in the first place. And this is the safe space to kind of explore them, but you still might not feel great about exploring them.
Yeah. I mean, there are absolutely kinks that can arise from traumatic situations, but that doesn't mean that you can't reclaim them in a way that is extremely meaningful to you. And I think one of the things that I like to see modeled in kinky games is aftercare, because exploring kinks can be traumatic in itself. It can be very hard on the psyche. And aftercare is not just about cuddling or about, rubbing arnica cream on the bruises on someone's bum, but it can also be about recentering both or maybe more than two partners in a situation afterwards, and being like, you are loved, you are safe, everything is okay, and bringing you back to yourself.
Do you think that second scene that you mentioned in Dragon Age Inquisition is basically them attempting aftercare?
Interesting. I mean, obviously it's not a sexual scene in any way, because he very quickly turns you down, but I don't think it counts as aftercare in a strictly sexual sense, but I think it is modeling the same kind of compassion that aftercare is all about.
Maybe our listeners don't know what aftercare is in a strictly sexual sense.
Yeah. Okay. Well, after, a rather intense bout of whatever kink you're exploring, usually this is done in a sort of bondage or a BDSM kind of sense, but it can be in anything, absolutely anything, even if it doesn't involve any kind of like violent spanking, bondage, tying up, anything. It can be anything at all. Afterwards, after you are finished, or even just after you have withdrawn consent, or even in the middle, you can engage in aftercare, which is basically often a sort of reassuring phase between you and whoever you were kinking around with. And
like kink as a verb. I like it.
It is reassuring. Often it is in relationships. So it is reassuring that person that even though perhaps in the role play scenario you were behaving like a bastard, you actually very much love them. And if you were being demeaning, then you don't really think that about them. You can say this, you can just give them hugs, you can just like stroke their hair and have a sort of intimate moment that doesn't require that kink or sex in any way. It is a loving and tender moment to reaffirm that the scene is over, as it were.
Do you know if any kink sex games actually do that? Because that sounds, I mean, it's easy to see with, in person, right? As a thing to be done. It's harder to see about how that would be programmed into that kind of context where someone is coming to the game. But do you know of any examples?
Yeah, I think visual novels are very good at it. It's a very easy thing to put into a sexy visual novel, to be like, and now this is the scene where you cuddle. I think that's what most people will think of when they think of like aftercare, is the sort of post-coital cuddle moment. Like that's a thing that a lot of people do, even if they're not engaging in kinks. It is a very human thing to do, I think.
I talk about this a lot in terms of just regular game design, as I think it's really important to have a denouement.
Yeah.
Because the player has had some sort of has had some sort of really intense experience to get through the end of the game, right? And it doesn't, again, it's not a sexual, it's not even a kinky experience. It's just a game experience. It's just an intense game experience. And it's very, very important to have built into the game some sort of denouement that shows that everything is going to be okay. Here's what just happened. And it's important to give players a moment to absorb and understand and come to grips with whatever has just happened.
Absolutely. I do like thinking of a denouement as narrative aftercare. That's quite funny.
Yes.
Yes.
Basically, exactly right. Or gameplay
having the
aftercare.
moment of like,
if you played
silence.
Journey does a great job of this.
Yeah.
If you played Journey.
Often it's the credits. A lot of games are just like, and scene, and then you're just left having emotions while the credits roll, and you're like, what do I do with all these feelings? So I think, absolutely, thinking of aftercare as a denouement, like a sort of relieving of tension, and you can sort of sit there with your feelings and let them all sort of dissipate. That's really important.
Do you think that there are some kinks that if a game has these kinks that they should demand content warnings, or do you think that all kinks should demand the content warnings? How do you think we should do the content warning situation?
So I thought about how sort of content warnings and consent are modeled in real life, which is usually the red, yellow, green light situation. And those are while things are actively going on. You could do it beforehand, I guess. You could do one of those like checklists where you say, I would do this, I wouldn't do this, I might do this if you're into it. But generally it tends to be red, yellow, green. If you are saying green, it is enthusiastic consent. If you are saying yellow, it's kind of a whoa there, cowboy, or yes, but it could mean a bunch of different things. And then
what does that mean? Because we understand yes and no. What does maybe sort of, does this mean I want to get going into this, but I want to have the chance to withdraw consent from this?
Yeah, I mean, in a sexual context, I think you would have to give more context. You can't just be like yellow, because that doesn't really tell you much except so you could say yellow goes slower or whatever.
It's a metaphor. It's a traffic metaphor, right? So it means proceed with caution.
Yep, exactly.
Okay,
I haven't driven in a while. Yeah, absolutely. But when I try to map that onto games, it's much more difficult, because as we've just discussed, yellow needs context, and games tend to be binary. Yellow consent is hard to do in a game. So when it comes to content warnings, you kind of have to be binary with it. You have to say, do you want this, yes or no? Because maybe doesn't mean anything in a game. There isn't a setting for maybe, especially not with further context, like maybe, but if it's this, or maybe, but only this far.
I'm wondering if potentially the way you put it earlier of having just a list of like, yes, yes, no, 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 to the point where it's enough of a combination that the game knows what specifically to put in there. But it's not a simple yes, no to the kink. It's, you have more specific things in the sense that at the beginning, or maybe at any point in the game, you can go to the setting and change your consent settings. Is that kind of what's the ideal here, I guess, is the question. What's the ideal?
The question, I think, when it comes to content warnings is, let's say that is how it's done. In a kinky game that tackles a lot of different kinks, you start off and it gives you a list of, 30 kinks, and you say which ones you are into and which ones you aren't. If you say that you aren't into kinks, do you skip all scenes with those kinks in? Does it blur them out? It's extremely difficult to write a game as it is, especially if you're having to write a game with the knowledge that people might be skipping half the content.
Right.
And I don't know how that would work, except for writing a bunch of different vignettes and only giving the player the ones that they've opted into, which is not really a game as much as it is a collection of short stories.
Right.
Producers don't really like spending a lot of money on vignettes that only half of the audience is ever going to see.
Well, Again, I called it ideal, right? Ideal might not be practical, right? But the typical relationship between the two is you think about what the ideal would be, and you try to do what's practically what it's practical to do towards that ideal.
Yeah.
I can imagine a game in which the choices that you make as you go sort of set these sliders. So I can imagine these different sliders that go from green to red through some shades of yellow in between. As you're playing, the choices that you're making, they're giving you the choices in context of the game, and they're not giving them outside of context in some sort of screen. But at some point, you can imagine going into and looking at these settings now and going, oh, well, I did not know this about me. I guess I'm into this, and I'm not. I wouldn't be into that.
Yeah, I think the other issue with content warnings is that they can never accurately show you how you're going to feel about a particular situation. For example, if a game says, right, this next scene contains non-consensual sex, that could mean a lot of things. It could mean that there's violence involved. It could mean that there's blackmail involved. It could mean that there's a supernatural force involved. It could mean that your character is asleep. There's a lot of different things it can mean. And then you can have the content warning detail all of those. Even then, you are not going to have a visceral reaction to a description of something in every case. And once you are expected to live through it, you will have that reaction. So even with content warnings, you can't fully know that you're going to be comfortable or not comfortable with something.
And notice, even and if you give the description, you've just potentially ruined the scene. Right.
That's
the other issue, right? One way to deal with the kinks issue in games is to ignore it altogether and leave kinks entirely out of games. What do you think would be lost if essentially game designers everywhere essentially said, no more kinks in sex games, no more kinks in non-sex games, where essentially, this topic is too risque for us to deal with? What would be lost?
Well, for a start, it'd be very hard to enforce because, as I've mentioned, a lot of kinks you wouldn't expect them to be kinks. But to answer it more seriously, I think what would be lost, firstly, is self-expression. A lot of kink games are pretty autobiographical, or at least in some way, even if they're not literally about the creators' lives. They are a form of expressing your identity and yourself. And I think that's extremely important in games. That's what games are all about for me. But secondly, I think we would lose a lot of the queer community in games. Queerness and kinks are sort of inextricably linked. And I don't know enough about like the academics of queer theory to really have a good answer as to why. I just know that they are in a lot of really important ways. You know, the ideas of expression and identity are core to both queerness and kinkiness.
Acceptance of sexual minorities.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right.
Maybe.
And just this sort of like really beautiful sense of knowing oneself that I think is important to both communities. And there's a lot of pride in both kinky games and queer games, and kinky creators and queer creators. There's a lot of, just this really, really beautiful sense of pride that even if you're not into kinks, even if you're not queer, I think you can look at that and see how incredibly important it is to have people who are so proud of themselves, proud of their community, proud of the place that they've found and the family they've created. And even though I think a lot of people think of kinks as sort of like sexy, raunchy, dirty stuff, they can be, but they can also be this really lovely tool of connecting with other people. And I think that is what we would lose.
All right, Kate. So what do you want to leave our listeners with?
If I am speaking directly to you, listener, hello, I would encourage you to be experimental, to try everything once in terms of, kinks and video games, not in terms of poison. And at worst, if you try everything, you'll have a better understanding of yourself. If you try games that are about gender, sexuality, identity, you'll come out of that being more secure in who you already are at worst. And knowing what you don't like and what you aren't is just as powerful as knowing what you are.
All
Awesome.
right. Well said, Kate.
Thank you.
All right. Wow, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on, Kate Gray. Pleasure. Yeah.
Yay.
All right. Play nice, everybody. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.